In this podcast, I'm going to be talking about form and how to spot it, because I know that this is an issue that people often find rather difficult to get to grips with. I imagine by now you're dealing with the fact that the concept of analysing a text for its technical features breaks down three ways: language, form, and structure. Now, while language and structure are fairly straightforward ideas to get your head around, form can be harder to pin down. Its definition seems somewhat less intuitive. So what I'm going to try to do over the course of this podcast is not to just give you the definition of the word, but to illustrate what examples of form might look like within a text, and how you could go about spotting those when it comes to writing essays and exams. Now, while I'm focusing on Great Expectations, it's important to note that the points I'm making can be generalised very easily to other texts that you study over the course of your education in English. Right, so what's form? Form refers to the way the text as a whole has been put together. When you're talking about language and structure, you can often zoom in very, very closely. Form requires you to zoom out a little bit more. The individual examples of language and structure that you find, when put together, create the form. You might almost call it the way the text occupies the space on the page, which is how one of my old lecturers used to put it. Now, in poetry, you can see this quite easily. The rhyme, the rhythm, the line lengths are all part of the form. Individual examples of rhyme or rhythm or line lengths might be structure, but the overall package is form. In drama, it's going to be those features that are unique to plays, like stage directions, lighting, entrances and exits, that kind of thing. And in prose fiction, like Great Expectations, it's going to include the genre. The fact that the novel is a Bildungsroman. The fact that it's in the first person and past tense. The fact that the narrator is retrospective. I'm not looking at individual examples here. It's the entirety of the novel that I'm talking about, which I acknowledge can be difficult to deal with, particularly when you are writing essays based on extracts, for example. So you've got to remember that the individual little bits and pieces that you will find in the extracts all contribute to the form. And the important thing to take note of is that these three features, language, structure and form, work together. What that means is that when it comes to looking for examples and writing about examples, don't try to separate them out as if they're talking about completely different things. Because they're not. They all contribute to the overall package, which is the text itself. And it's by talking about how these features work with each other and interrelate with each other that you really start to get to grips with what the technical features of the text can tell you in the first place. So let's look at an actual example and I'll show you what I mean. I'm taking this quotation from towards the end of the novel. This refers to Magwitch being condemned to death in chapter 56. Both were passing on with absolute equality to the greater judgment that knoweth all things and cannot err. Now you'll see I've singled out the verb knoweth, and I've pointed out that I've called it an archaic verb conjugation. In other words, the way Dickens has chosen to modify the verb know, knoweth rather than knows, is deliberately old-fashioned. Now, so far, this is language analysis. But if I were to then take that as a starting point and expand it outwards to the entire phrase, I can make a point about the language style in general. Specifically, Dickens is having Pip talk in the style of the King James Bible, which is a very, very important English translation of the Bible from the early 17th century. Now, the point here is not just knoweth. The point is the entirety of the language style of which the verb knoweth is just a single part. And my argument here would be that Dickens is having Pip borrow the form of the Bible so that he can carry along that text's moral authority with it. Now, while the language analysis is part of it, I'm not just talking about an individual word. That individual word is important, but it's part of a larger form. And so this is how you can relate language to form, effectively by zooming out. The language gives you the small details. You stand back from the language and look at the entire text, and then you have the form. So other examples that you can find in Great Expectation would be anything that deals with the conventions of the genre. And by conventions I mean the kind of things that a reader might expect to see if they're reading a particular kind of novel. Gothic features come up quite a lot in Great Expectations. Romance, mystery with the plot line of who was responsible for attacking Mrs. Joe. And also cases where they are subverted. So, for example, although Great Expectations has elements of romance, it also defies those stereotypes quite a lot. The happy ending with Estella is somewhat awkward. She doesn't quite fit the traditional character archetype of the feminine love interest. She leans in that direction a bit, but it's a very, very imperfect fit for her. Plot twists would be an example. Happy endings, sad endings, and like I've mentioned, the overall language style. So beyond individual words and beyond individual sentences. All these things would be examples of form. And one of the clearest examples, I think, is in chapter 39, which is at the very end of volume 2, and it's the chapter where Magwitch makes his sudden unexpected return into Pip's life. This chapter features 2 plot twists. The first is Magwitch turning up to begin with, and the second happens a couple of pages later, and it's the revelation that actually it was Magwitch all the time who was the source of Pip's wealth, not Miss Havisham as Pip had assumed. Now, the way this chapter works is that Dickens uses one plot twist to hide another one. The surprise of Magwitch's return occupies Pip's attention and the reader's attention, and it leaves us completely unprepared for the second twist, a bigger twist, that follows a couple of pages later. Now, if we're talking about where the twists come, and the fact that one twist is used to hide a second, that I would say is really an example of structure. But the use of the twist in the first place, that is an example of form. So here we've got an example of analysing both structure and form together. To summarise, the way to approach form is to try not to separate it out from language and structure. It gets much easier to talk about when you think of it as working with those other elements. It is often difficult to pin down because it seems abstract and it's hard to focus on single, individual, small-scale, quotable examples that you can use as evidence for your points. But it is the foundation of language and structure. And so what I would encourage you to do if you're trying to make a point about form is to try to make a point about language or structure first and then scale it up to talk about form. Because if you're looking at a very, very small example, the form is just going to be masked behind the fine details. So you have to stand back from the text a little bit to find it.